This is James Menendez with Newshour. Well, let's head to Israel, where for months there have been mass demonstrations against a government plan to overhaul the country's judicial system, a plan which the protesters say imperils democracy in the country. The government, a coalition that includes far-right nationalist and religious parties, has argued that judges have become too powerful in influence on policy. Now, though, the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says one of the most contentious parts of the bill will be dropped, the so-called override clause, which would have allowed Parliament to overturn rulings from the Supreme Court. Here's what he told the Wall Street Journal.
I already changed a few things right after the original proposal was put forward. I said that the idea of an override clause where the Parliament, the Knesset, can override the decisions of the Supreme Court with a simple majority, I threw that out. I said it's out, and I think it's very clear that the way of choosing judges, it's not going to be the current structure, but it's not going to be the original structure.
One of those who've been protesting these judicial changes is Tamar Krongrad. She's also founder of USA for Israel Democracy, a group of volunteers that tries to engage American Jews in Netanyahu's judicial reforms. What does she make of Mr. Netanyahu's comments?
My response to Bibi Netanyahu is that the man does not know how to speak truth. And so the fact that he's lying again is just to throw sand in the eyes of the audience. You know, he's been ostracized by the leaders of the free world. And at this point, he'll just do anything to get into their good graces. So, by the way, you don't have to take my word for it. About 10 minutes after he lied, Miki Zohar, who's a minister in his own party, said in a radio interview in Hebrew, which is not surprising, that the clause has not been removed, that Bibi's goal is to try to calm everyone down, that there's a rhythm and not a blitz, and that he's changing tactics, but in the end game, it's very much the same. They want a dictatorship.
Right. I mean, he was saying that it was his intention to drop the clause. I mean, why are you so certain that he won't do it?
Well, I'm just looking at history. I mean, I'm just looking at the fact that you can look at the Star interview and very recently other things that he's done. It's not just what he lied about today, right? It's what he hasn't said. There are various ways to turn a country into dictatorship, and you don't just pop up one day and say, "Oh, guys, I want a dictatorship." They do it slowly and carefully. And at the beginning, 6 months ago, he didn't do it slowly and carefully. He did it as a blitz. And now they realize they made a mistake, and actually it was a blessing in disguise.
He isn't, of course, here to defend himself or what he said, but let's just for a moment give him the benefit of the doubt, if we can. If he does mean this and the clause is removed, would that be enough? Would that address your grievances about this plan?
No, of course not, because he wants to remove the way judges are selected, which would basically mean a complete removal of our checks and balances and give him absolute control. And the other thing that he hasn't mentioned in his lie of the last 5 minutes is that he wants to bar the courts from using a reasonable standard when they review decisions and appointments of elected officials, which basically means that he could put his son and his wife as ministers in the government, and he could fire the attorney general whenever he feels like. That's just an example. There are also 193 laws proposed, which he is going to push through, which basically takes away every right of any individual and every minority in Israel. Women, gays, lesbians, seculars, Reformed Jews, conservative Jews, anyone you want, throw in the bucket. It's all there.
So you don't like him, you don't like the government, you don't like its laws, but I mean, that is democracy, isn't it? Governments win elections and sometimes they do things that people don't like.
Yes, there are many leaders in many countries that I don't like who are democratically elected. First of all, this government is full of racists and extremists who absolutely do not get the majority of the Israeli population. And not only that, when they take this democratic election and turn it on its head and basically take it all out of context, then we are absolutely, not only do we have the absolute responsibility and the obligation to stand up. Democracy is also protection of minorities, and we will not let that happen in our country. Anyone who cares about Israel will not let it happen.
So the protests will continue, you think?
Yes, they will.
To the same degree, do you think? Do you think people will see this, though, as perhaps a bit of a concession?
I think the Israeli protesters, the democracy movement understands fully well. It's not only a lie, and like I said at the beginning, it's a lie that the members of his coalition are frantically running around right now telling everyone in Hebrew that it's not really true what he said. Even if this were, if I'll go with you for a minute and say, even if this were absolutely true and he's going to remove that, that doesn't mean anything. We still have 193 laws that they are waiting to pass, which will take away all of our rights. We are fighting for the soul of our country. And one interview with one person doesn't make everything else go away.
Tamar Krongrad. Well, let's go live to Jerusalem and talk to the BBC's Yolande Nell. And Tamar, pretty clear what she makes of Mr. Netanyahu's comments. What's the wider reaction been?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this is quite a surprise announcement by the Prime Minister, even though he has made hints that he would drop this most contentious part of his judicial reform plans in the past. I mean, yes, he definitely failed to satisfy the leaders of the protests who have really caused upheaval in the country since early this year. They see that the proposed changes don't go far enough and are going to continue their demonstrations, they say. But it's also really angered Mr. Netanyahu's coalition partners. I mean, if you look at Itamar Ben-Gvir, who's the far-right religious nationalist national security minister, he's accused the Prime Minister of surrendering to civil unrest, saying it's a victory for violence, a loss for Israel. We were elected to bring governance and change, and reform is a cornerstone of that promise. And then on the ultra-Orthodox side, one of the ministers telling a newspaper here that this was one of the reasons why his party joined the governing coalition. It's written up in their agreement. And he said any other agreement's not acceptable to us. So, I mean, for the ultra-Orthodox, they get very upset about the Supreme Court's powers. They feel that they have been, in the past, affected by decisions it's made, and they don't want it now to strike down legislation which they're trying to push through, which would give a much bigger exemption to members of their community from the military draft.
And just briefly, Yolande, is there any danger that the coalition could collapse?
I mean, I think we're still far from that, but the divisions are there, and it's something that we're constantly watching in this government. It doesn't always seem like an easy coalition. The Prime Minister trying to bring together the concerns of his coalition partners, but also he has to answer to some of the criticisms that have come out from people in the country. These deep social divisions have opened up broadly but not exclusively between secular and religious Israelis, the debate that's going on about the nature of democracy, and of course lots and lots of concerns from Israel's partners overseas as well. And there were comments from the outgoing US ambassador to Israel saying just this week that he didn't think that it would pass unilaterally in its current form, the judicial reform plans.
Yes, a very tough balancing act. Yolande, thank you very much indeed. Yolande now joining us live there from Jerusalem. And that brings us to the end of this edition of Newshour. Thanks so much for being with us. Until tomorrow. Bye-bye.